If they ever tell you that talent has an address, don't believe them. The digital countdown above the backstage corridor flashed in bright red numbers. 10 minutes until the National Young Artists Showcase began inside Boston Symphony Hall, and the building vibrated with the soft murmur of hundreds of guests taking their seats beneath crystal chandeliers and polished balconies. Beyond the heavy velvet curtains, donors, judges, reporters, and families filled every row, dressed in tailored suits and elegant evening gowns, waiting to celebrate the nation's brightest young musicians. But none of them knew that the girl whose music would change the night was no longer allowed to walk onto that stage. Ava Brooks pressed both palms against the soundproof rehearsal room door. It didn't move. She twisted the handle again, slower this time, hoping she had simply panicked and missed something. The metal stayed perfectly still. Her breathing became shallow, not from fear alone, but from disbelief. "Hello?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Excuse me?" Someone locked the door. Only silence answered her. The thick acoustic walls swallowed every word before it could escape into the hallway. She stepped backward until her shoulders touched the grand piano waiting in the center of the rehearsal room. Morning sunlight filtered through a narrow window high above, laying pale strips of gold across the polished black floor. Everything looked beautiful. Everything felt impossibly wrong. Just 15 minutes earlier, she had stood outside the rehearsal room wearing the same navy blue dress her mother had carefully pressed before leaving for another overnight shift at Massachusetts General Hospital. It wasn't expensive. It had been altered twice by a neighbor with a sewing machine older than Ava herself. Still, her mother had smiled while adjusting the tiny silver ribbon around her daughter's wrist. "You already belong there," she had whispered. "Never let anyone decide otherwise." Ava remembered those words now as clearly as if they were still floating beside her. A faint click echoed beyond the door. Footsteps. She hurried forward. "Please," she called. "I'm in here." The footsteps stopped. Through the narrow gap beneath the door, she saw the shadow of someone standing outside. A familiar male voice spoke with calm certainty. "The judges have made their decision." Ava froze. "What do you mean?" she asked. "There's been a change." "A change?" "You won't be performing today." She stared at the door. "There has to be a mistake." "No mistake." His tone remained polished, almost rehearsed. "This competition represents a certain image, Miss Brooks." She swallowed hard. "I earned my place." No answer came for several long seconds. Then the man spoke quietly enough that he probably believed no one else would ever hear the words. "Some stages simply aren't built for girls from neighborhoods like yours." The footsteps faded down the hallway. Ava remained perfectly still. She could no longer hear anything except the slow beating of her own heart. Across the room, the piano waited beneath a single spotlight left on from earlier rehearsals. Its glossy surface reflected her face, her tightly braided hair, and eyes trying very hard not to fill with tears. She walked toward the instrument almost without thinking. Her fingertips rested gently on the smooth ivory keys, but she didn't press them. Not yet. She had spent years believing music opened doors people tried to close. Today, someone had locked both away at once. Beyond the walls, applause erupted somewhere inside the concert hall as the master of ceremonies welcomed the audience. The sound reached her only as a distant vibration, like thunder rolling across the harbor. Another announcement followed, impossible to understand through the insulated walls. Then more applause, louder this time. The show had begun. Ava lowered herself onto the piano bench. She closed her eyes for only a moment and drew one slow breath. Somewhere in that audience sat people who believed they already knew exactly who deserved to be heard. None of them knew that the most important performance of the evening had just been locked behind a door. 72 hours earlier, the first rays of sunlight slipped between rows of brick apartment buildings in Dorchester, one of Boston's oldest neighborhoods, painting warm streaks across narrow sidewalks still damp from the cool New England morning. Long before school buses filled the streets and coffee shops welcomed commuters, one small apartment on the third floor was already awake. The soft melody of a worn, upright piano floated through an open window, gentle enough not to disturb the neighbors, yet clear enough that anyone passing below instinctively slowed their steps. Ava Brooks sat on a weathered wooden bench with perfect posture despite the uneven floor beneath her feet. The piano had several faded keys. One pedal squeaked every time she pressed it, and the finish had long ago surrendered its shine. But to Ava, it sounded more beautiful than any concert grand she had ever touched. Every note carried memories. Every chord reminded her why she refused to stop practicing. Her mother, Denise Brooks, quietly tied her hospital badge around her neck while pouring oatmeal into two simple bowls. She paused beside the doorway instead of interrupting the music. She had learned years ago that mornings belonged to the piano before they belonged to the world. Ava finished the final phrase and smiled without turning around. "Good morning, Mom," Denise smiled back. "You have been awake since 5 again. I wanted to fix the ending." "Did you?" Ava shrugged with a quiet laugh. "Not yet. It still feels like it wants to say something more." Denise placed one bowl on the small kitchen table. "Maybe it is waiting until someone is ready to listen." Ava walked over, still carrying the sheet music covered with handwritten notes and erased pencil marks. "Do you think people at the competition will hear it the way I do?" Denise reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "The right people will." Ava glanced toward the window where the Boston skyline shimmered faintly beyond the rooftops. "Sometimes I wonder if they will only see where I came from." Denise answered without hesitation. "Then let them keep looking. You make them hear who you are." Those words settled quietly into Ava's heart as they finished breakfast together. 40 minutes later, they stepped outside into crisp autumn air carrying backpacks instead of expensive instrument cases. As they walked toward the subway station, familiar neighbors waved from front porches and corner stores. Mr. Alvarez, who owned the neighborhood grocery, leaned out his doorway. "Big rehearsal today?" Ava nodded with a bright smile. "Yes, sir. Play the way you play for us." "I will try." "Do not try," he replied with a grin. "Just be Ava." She laughed before following her mother down the sidewalk. The Orange Line train rattled toward downtown Boston, filled with students, nurses, construction workers, office employees, and musicians carrying polished violin cases. Ava quietly studied the score resting on her lap, while stations slipped past outside the window. Every measure had been rewritten dozens of times. Some corners of the pages had become soft from being folded and unfolded so often. Across from her, an older man lowered his newspaper and listened as she silently tapped rhythms against her knee. "Composer?" he asked kindly. Ava looked up. "I hope so someday." "You already are if you wrote it," she smiled. "Thank you." By the time they reached Back Bay, Denise checked the time on her phone and sighed. "I have to head to the hospital." Ava hugged her tightly. "I will call after rehearsal. No matter what happens today, no matter what." Denise brushed an invisible speck of dust from Ava's sleeve. "Remember something." "What?" "Awards can recognize talent, but they do not create it." Ava nodded slowly. "I know." "Good, because you had music before anyone knew your name." They separated at the corner where busy sidewalks overflowed with people hurrying beneath rows of maple trees glowing with early fall colors. Ava adjusted the strap of her backpack and continued toward Boston Symphony Hall alone, her steps steady despite the enormous building waiting ahead. She did not notice the black luxury sedan parked across the street or the well-dressed members of the competition committee stepping from its doors while quietly studying the list of finalists. None of them recognized the girl walking toward the entrance carrying a backpack instead of prestige, wearing determination instead of privilege, and holding a melody that would soon challenge everything they believed about greatness. By late afternoon, the marble entrance of Boston Symphony Hall reflected the golden light of the setting sun, while black sedans lined the curb one after another, delivering board members, sponsors, and families whose names had appeared on donation plaques for decades. Inside the private executive lounge on the second floor, polished oak walls displayed portraits of former patrons whose fortunes had shaped the New England Youth Arts Foundation. Every chair around the long conference table was occupied except one. Richard Montgomery entered without hurrying, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him with effortless precision, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression calm enough to command attention without raising his voice. At 58 years old, he had built Montgomery Financial Group into one of the most respected investment firms in Massachusetts, and for nearly 15 years he had served as chairman of the foundation responsible for selecting the country's most promising young musicians. As conversations faded, everyone instinctively turned toward him. "Good afternoon," Richard said as he placed a leather portfolio on the table. "Let us make this year's showcase one our sponsors will remember." Around the room, polite smiles appeared almost on cue. Beside him sat Eleanor Whitmore, director of the competition, known for her impeccable manners and equally rigid opinions. She opened a folder containing photographs and biographies of every finalist. "Our technical evaluations are complete," she announced. "Now we simply finalize presentation order and promotional material." Another member adjusted his glasses while scanning the pages. Most of these students already have impressive conservatory recommendations. Eleanor nodded. As expected, she paused when one photograph reached the center of the table. A simple school portrait of Ava Brooks rested against a page noticeably thinner than the others because there were fewer accomplishments printed beneath her name. Richard glanced down. She received one of the highest anonymous performance scores. Eleanor folded her hands. Yes, musically she performed well. Then why does everyone suddenly look uncomfortable? No one answered immediately. Finally, another committee member cleared his throat. Chairman Montgomery, talent is only one part of representing the foundation. Richard remained silent. Eleanor continued carefully. The national media follows this competition very closely. Our winner becomes the face of youth arts across the country. Richard leaned back slightly. Go on. Eleanor chose her words with practiced diplomacy. Image matters. Public perception matters. Families supporting this program expect a certain level of polish. Richard looked again at Ava's file. Her address listed a modest apartment building in Dorchester. Her school orchestra had limited funding. Her recommendation letters came from public school teachers and a church music director instead of famous professors. Across the table, another donor quietly remarked, "Sponsors like stories of excellence, but they also like familiarity." Someone else added, "Charlotte Montgomery photographs beautifully on stage." Richard slowly lifted his eyes. "My daughter is not part of this discussion." Eleanor smiled politely. "Of course not. We are simply acknowledging that students from established musical families naturally represent the tradition audiences recognize." Richard said nothing, but the room relaxed, interpreting his silence as agreement. Eleanor slid another folder forward. Inside were promotional mock-ups featuring elegant young performers beneath the foundation logo. None resembled Ava. "These materials go to national media tomorrow morning," she explained. "Consistency is important." Richard stared thoughtfully at the images before asking, "Has anyone actually spoken with Miss Brooks?" "There has been no need. Have any of you heard her composition outside the blind judging process?" Again, the room became quiet. Eleanor answered first. "Anonymous judging exists precisely so personal stories do not interfere with objective evaluation." Richard closed the folder without another comment, although something about the conversation lingered in his mind longer than he expected. Down the hallway, another door opened as finalists arrived for orientation, laughing nervously while carrying violins, cello cases, and music folders. Charlotte Montgomery walked confidently beside two scholarship students from prestigious private academies, greeting committee members by their first names. A volunteer handed every contestant an identification badge. When Ava reached the registration table carrying only her backpack and carefully protected manuscript, the volunteer smiled warmly before searching through several envelopes. "One moment," she said. "Your badge is not with the others." Ava waited patiently while contestants continued filing past her toward rehearsal rooms. Eleanor noticed the brief delay from across the lobby. She leaned toward another committee member and spoke softly enough that Ava could not hear. "We cannot afford surprises this year." The man nodded once. "Everything will proceed exactly as planned." Above them, crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors, making the building appear welcoming to every visitor who entered. Yet hidden behind courteous smiles and graceful conversation, decisions were already taking shape that had nothing to do with music at all. As orientation came to an end, the bustle inside Boston Symphony Hall slowly gave way to quiet concentration. Contestants disappeared into rehearsal rooms, volunteers rolled music stands across polished floors, and stage technicians checked lighting cues one final time before the showcase. Ava followed the signs toward practice room 7, holding her handwritten score carefully against her chest, as though it carried something far more valuable than paper and ink. She had no idea that the melody she protected had already changed one family's life months before. It had happened on a rainy Saturday afternoon at Massachusetts General Hospital. Ava had been waiting for her mother to finish an unexpected overtime shift after a nurse called in sick. Rather than sitting in the crowded waiting area scrolling through her phone like most teenagers, Ava wandered quietly toward the hospital chapel, where an aging upright piano rested near a stained glass window overlooking the Charles River. A small handwritten sign read, "Visitors welcome to play." She asked the volunteer at the front desk, "Is it all right if I practice for a few minutes?" The elderly volunteer smiled warmly. "Music always belongs here." Ava thanked her before sitting at the piano. She closed her eyes and began playing a gentle melody she had been composing for weeks, one that rose slowly like the first light after a long winter morning. She called it Second Sunrise because it reminded her that hope sometimes arrived after people believed the day was already over. Each note drifted softly through the quiet hallway, blending with distant conversations, rolling carts, and muted footsteps. She never noticed a young boy standing several yards away near the pediatric wing. Ethan Montgomery, 10 years old, stared toward the piano without moving. For nearly 3 weeks, he had barely spoken after surviving a frightening boating accident that had left him emotionally withdrawn. Doctors described his condition as severe emotional trauma. Therapists patiently worked with him every day, yet he rarely answered questions and often avoided everyone around him, including his own father. Richard Montgomery had tried everything money could provide. Specialists flew in from New York and Chicago. Child psychologists adjusted treatment plans. Music therapists rotated through the hospital. Nothing seemed to reach Ethan. That afternoon, Richard stood outside his son's room speaking quietly with a physician. "Any progress today?" he asked. The doctor sighed gently. "Very little. Healing cannot always be scheduled." Before Richard could answer, the faint sound of piano music floated down the corridor. Ethan slowly turned his head toward the melody. The doctor noticed first. "Has he reacted to music before?" Richard shook his head. "Never like that." Ethan took one cautious step into the hallway, then another. Richard watched silently, afraid that even speaking might interrupt whatever was happening. The boy followed the music until he reached the chapel doorway. Ava remained completely focused on the piano, unaware that anyone had entered behind her. Ethan stood quietly beside the last row of wooden chairs. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing slowed. For the first time in weeks, the tight expression on his face softened. When Ava finished the final chord, silence lingered gently in the room. She looked up and noticed the boy. "Hi," she said with a kind smile. "Did I interrupt your quiet place?" Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, after several long seconds, he whispered 2 words that made Richard stop breathing for a moment. "Play again." Ava smiled. "Of course." She played the melody once more, slower this time. Ethan walked closer until he sat on the front pew, listening without fear. Richard remained at the doorway, unable to explain what he was seeing. The doctor quietly whispered, "This is the calmest I have seen him since he arrived." When the music ended a second time, Ava gathered her pages, believing she had simply shared a few peaceful minutes with a stranger. Ethan looked up at her and asked softly, "What is the song called?" "Second Sunrise," she replied. "I hope it makes people feel like tomorrow can still be beautiful." Ethan nodded slowly as though he understood every word. Just then a nurse hurried into the hallway calling Richard's name about an urgent insurance authorization. Richard reluctantly stepped away for only a few minutes. By the time he returned, Ava had already left to meet her mother after her shift. No one asked her name, no one wrote it down. The volunteer simply smiled while watching the teenager disappear through the hospital entrance, carrying nothing except her backpack and the unfinished score that one day would echo through a far grander hall. The memory of that afternoon disappeared into the rhythm of ordinary life for everyone except Ethan. He never knew the girl's name, but he remembered the melody with remarkable clarity, humming fragments of it during quiet moments until the nurses began calling it his sunrise song. 3 days after the hospital visit, he smiled for the first time in nearly a month. A week later, he agreed to join his therapist for a walk through the hospital garden. Richard Montgomery celebrated every small step, believing the treatment plan was finally beginning to work, never realizing that the greatest breakthrough had come from a teenager who quietly walked back to a subway station carrying sheet music in a worn backpack. Now, 72 hours later, that same teenager waited outside practice room 7 while volunteers finalized the rehearsal schedule. Contestants exchanged nervous greetings, tuned instruments, and rehearsed difficult passages under their breath. Charlotte Montgomery adjusted the elegant white dress her stylist had chosen and accepted compliments from parents who had known her family for years. "You are going to be wonderful," one sponsor said warmly. "Your father must be very proud." Charlotte smiled politely. "I just hope I play my best." Across the hallway, Ava sat alone reviewing the final page of Second Sunrise. She erased one tiny marking, rewrote 2 measures, then quietly whispered to herself, "That sounds right now." A volunteer approached with a clipboard. "Miss Brooks?" Ava looked up immediately. "Yes, ma'am? Would you please come with me for a quick administrative review?" Ava stood without hesitation. "Of course." The volunteer led her through a side corridor lined with framed photographs of previous champions. At the end of the hallway, Eleanor Whitmore waited beside a conference room door with another committee member. Her smile appeared courteous but unusually restrained. "Thank you for coming, Ava," Eleanor said. "Please step inside." Ava entered a small meeting room overlooking Huntington Avenue. Sunlight reflected across the polished table where several folders had already been arranged in perfect alignment. Eleanor closed the door softly behind them. "There has been an unexpected issue regarding your registration." Ava frowned. "My registration? A procedural concern? Did I forget a form?" "Not exactly." Eleanor folded her hands. "The committee has determined that your eligibility requires additional review." Ava blinked in confusion. "But I received confirmation weeks ago. Circumstances can change." "What circumstances?" The other committee member avoided eye contact while pretending to study paperwork. Ava looked from one face to the other. "I qualified through every audition," Eleanor answered calmly. "No one is questioning your effort. Then why can I not rehearse?" Silence settled heavily across the room. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "Some members believe you are not the strongest representative for this year's public program." Ava felt her stomach tighten. "Representative? The winner becomes more than a performer." "I understand. Image carries responsibility." Ava's voice remained respectful, but it grew firmer. "Is this about my music?" Eleanor hesitated just long enough to reveal the truth without saying it directly. There are many factors involved. Ava slowly lowered her score onto the table. "If someone played my composition without knowing my name, would they still say I do not belong?" Neither adult answered. The quiet became more painful than any explanation. Eleanor finally slid a document across the table. "Until the committee reaches a final decision, you will remain off the performance schedule." Ava stared at the page without touching it. "When will that decision be made?" "Before tonight's program begins." "Tonight?" "Yes." Ava looked toward the window where the golden dome of the Christian Science Plaza reflected the afternoon light. She thought about her mother finishing another exhausting shift, about every early morning spent practicing before school, about every note she had rewritten until it carried exactly the hope she wanted listeners to feel. She inhaled slowly before speaking again. "May I at least stay near the rehearsal rooms?" Eleanor offered another practiced smile. "We believe it would be better if you waited privately." A staff member opened the hallway door. "This way, Miss Brooks." Ava gathered her manuscript with careful hands and followed him without another word. The corridor became quieter with every step until they reached the isolated rehearsal room at the far end of the backstage wing. "Please wait here while the committee finishes its review," the staff member said. Ava entered the room believing someone would return in a few minutes. The door closed gently behind her. Then came the unmistakable sound of a lock turning from the outside. At almost the same moment, the loudspeaker echoed through the building. "Finalists, please report to the stage. The showcase will begin in 10 minutes." The applause rolling through Boston Symphony Hall reached the rehearsal room only as a faint vibration beneath the floor, like distant waves striking a harbor wall long after the storm had passed. Ava stood quietly beside the locked door for another minute, before accepting what her heart already knew. No one was coming back. She slowly returned to the grand piano in the middle of the room and rested her fingertips on its polished edge instead of the keys. The silence around her felt strangely familiar, not empty, but waiting. High above, the narrow window caught the last light of the Boston afternoon, and a soft beam settled across the sheet music resting on the piano stand. Second sunrise seemed almost to glow beneath the warm light. Ava smiled sadly. "At least someone still believes in you," she whispered to the pages. Outside the room, volunteers hurried through backstage corridors carrying clipboards, bottled water, and bouquets for the finalists. The evening program moved forward with perfect precision, while one name quietly disappeared from every announcement. In the audience, Richard Montgomery greeted donors from New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island with practiced confidence, yet every few minutes he glanced toward the wings as though expecting to recognize a face he could not quite remember. Ethan sat beside him wearing a navy blazer that still felt too formal for a 10-year-old. He listened politely while adults discussed investments, scholarships, and media coverage, but his attention drifted whenever faint notes from backstage floated through the enormous hall during final sound checks. "Dad," he asked softly, "are all the kids here today?" Richard smiled distractedly. "As far as I know." Ethan looked toward the stage. "I hope the girl with the sunrise song comes." Richard turned. "What girl?" Ethan shrugged. "The one from the hospital." Richard searched his memory. "We never learned who she was." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I know. I just wanted to hear her again." Before Richard could answer, the master of ceremonies stepped beneath the spotlight. The audience applauded warmly as the opening remarks welcomed distinguished guests and celebrated the foundation's commitment to young artistic excellence. Backstage, Charlotte Montgomery prepared to perform, while another contestant quietly stretched nervous fingers over an invisible keyboard. A stage manager glanced down the schedule. "Where is contestant number 12? Another volunteer answered without looking up. "Administrative hold." The stage manager frowned. "That is unfortunate. The committee already handled it." The conversation ended there, swallowed by the urgency of live production. Inside the rehearsal room, Ava finally sat at the piano bench. She did not intend to rehearse for the competition anymore because she believed that chance had already been taken away. Instead, she wanted to remember why she had written the piece before anyone attached scores, rankings, or expectations to it. She gently pressed the first key. The single note lingered in the quiet room with remarkable clarity. Then another followed. Soon the melody flowed naturally through the empty space, soft enough to comfort rather than impress. She played exactly as she had inside the hospital chapel months earlier. Not for judges, not for applause, but for one frightened child who needed hope more than perfection. The sound could not reach the audience through the thick walls, yet tiny vibrations escaped into the ventilation ducts above the ceiling. At almost the same moment, Ethan lifted his head. His eyes widened. "Dad." Richard looked over. "What is it?" Ethan remained perfectly still. "Do you hear that?" Richard listened. At first, he heard only distant movement behind the curtains. Then, hidden beneath the bustle of backstage preparations, a fragile melody drifted through the air for only a few seconds before fading again. Ethan gripped the armrest. "That is the Sunrise song." Richard's expression changed. "Are you certain?" Ethan nodded without hesitation. "I would know it anywhere." Richard slowly stood. Around him, donors continued polite conversations, unaware that anything unusual had happened. On stage, the first performer approached the piano as applause filled the hall once more. But Richard no longer looked toward the spotlight. He looked instead toward the backstage corridor where a melody from months ago had quietly returned, carrying with it the memory of a young girl whose face he had almost forgotten but whose music his son had never stopped hearing. Richard Montgomery remained standing while the audience applauded the opening performance, yet he heard almost none of it. His attention stayed fixed on the backstage entrance where the melody had quietly disappeared only moments before. Ethan tugged gently at his sleeve. "Dad, she is here." Richard looked down. "How can you be so sure?" Ethan answered with the certainty only a child could possess. "Nobody else plays it like that. She does not just play the note. She makes them feel warm." Those words settled heavily inside Richard's mind. Without another sentence, he stepped into the aisle and quietly motioned for the stage manager waiting near the side curtain. "Excuse me," Richard said. "Contestant number 12. Where is she?" The stage manager checked his clipboard. "Administrative review, sir." Richard frowned. "Administrative review during the finals? That is what I was told. Who made that decision?" "Mrs. Whitmore and the committee." Richard thanked him briefly before walking toward the backstage corridor. The farther he moved away from the audience, the quieter the building became. Bright stage lights gave way to narrow hallways illuminated by softer ceiling fixtures. Volunteers hurried past carrying sheet music, unaware that the chairman himself was now searching for a contestant whose name had almost disappeared from the evening. Near the rehearsal wing, he found Eleanor Whitmore speaking with two committee members. She smiled politely when she noticed him. "Richard, you should be in the front row." He did not return the smile. "Where is Ava Brooks?" Eleanor hesitated for only a heartbeat. There were concerns regarding her eligibility. What concerns? Representation, presentation, and procedural matters. Richard's voice remained calm, but every word became sharper. "Answer my question clearly." Eleanor folded her hands. The committee believed another finalist better reflected the image of this program. Richard studied her face in complete silence. Did her audition score change? No. Did anyone question her musical ability? Eleanor looked away. No. Then you removed one of the highest-scoring finalists because of image? Before Eleanor could answer, another faint phrase of piano music drifted through the hallway. Ethan, who had quietly followed his father with a volunteer, suddenly pointed toward the far end of the corridor. "She is over there." He began walking before anyone could stop him. Richard followed immediately. The melody grew clearer with every step until they reached the final rehearsal room. Ethan stopped outside the locked door. He placed one hand gently against the wood and closed his eyes. "It is her," he whispered. "Dad, she is the one from the hospital." Richard stared at the door. Memories rushed back all at once. A quiet chapel, a young girl at an old piano, his son asking for the music to continue. A melody called Second Sunrise. He looked toward the staff member standing nearby. Why is this room locked? The young employee swallowed nervously. Mrs. Whitmore instructed us to have Miss Brooks wait here until after the committee meeting. Richard asked one final question. Did she know the competition had already started? The employee lowered his head. Yes, sir. Silence settled over the hallway. Not angry silence, something heavier, the kind that arrives when a simple misunderstanding becomes impossible to defend. Richard slowly reached for the doorknob. It did not move. He looked at the employee. Please unlock it. The key trembled slightly as it slid into the lock. A soft click echoed through the hallway. Inside the room, Ava stopped playing the moment she heard the mechanism turn. She stood beside the piano as the door slowly opened. Warm hallway light spilled across the polished floor. Ethan smiled the instant he saw her. I knew it was you. Ava blinked in surprise. You remember me? Ethan nodded enthusiastically. You played the Sunrise song for me at the hospital. Ava's expression softened. I am glad you are feeling better. Richard stepped into the room but did not speak immediately. His eyes moved from Ava to the handwritten score resting on the piano. The title across the top of the page caught his attention. Second Sunrise. His breathing slowed. You wrote this? Ava nodded quietly. Yes, sir. You are the girl who helped my son. I only played the piano. Ethan shook his head. No, you helped me remember that tomorrow could still be beautiful. Richard looked back at Ava, and for the first time since entering Boston Symphony Hall that evening, he was no longer seeing a contestant, a file, or an address on an application. He was looking at the young composer whose kindness had reached his son when wealth, influence, and every expert he could afford had failed to do the same. Ava looked from Ethan to Richard, still unable to understand how a quiet afternoon inside a hospital chapel had suddenly become the center of the most important night of her life. She held the handwritten pages of Second Sunrise against her chest, as if they were the only familiar thing left in the room. Richard took a slow breath before speaking. Miss Brooks, I owe you an apology. Ava immediately shook her head. You do not have to apologize, sir. Yes, Richard answered gently. I do. His voice remained calm, but there was no trace of the polished confidence that had filled the boardroom only hours earlier. I trusted a process without asking whether it was still serving its purpose. That failure belongs to me. Ava lowered her eyes. I only wanted the chance to play. Richard nodded. And you earned that chance. He turned toward Eleanor Whitmore, who had quietly followed the group down the hallway. The color had faded from her face as she looked from Ethan to the handwritten score resting on the piano. Richard asked one simple question. Did anyone on this committee know she was the composer who helped my son? Eleanor answered honestly. No. Did anyone ask? She remained silent. Richard looked around the hallway where several staff members had stopped working after sensing something unusual had unfolded. Then tonight we judged a story we never bothered to hear. No one responded. The silence itself felt like an answer. Ethan stepped closer to Ava. Will you play the Sunrise song for everyone? Ava smiled softly. I thought I was not allowed. Richard looked directly at the stage manager. Change that. The stage manager blinked in surprise. Sir, the program has already started. Then we will adjust the program. But the schedule. Richard interrupted him gently. Music exists to move people, not calendars. The stage manager nodded and hurried toward the stage entrance. Inside the concert hall, another finalist had just finished performing. Warm applause echoed beneath the high ceiling as the master of ceremonies prepared to introduce the next contestant. Suddenly, an assistant approached him with a handwritten note. He read it once, looked backstage in visible surprise, then quietly nodded. Meanwhile, Richard turned back toward Ava. Would you be willing to perform? Ava hesitated. After everything that happened? Richard answered without hesitation, especially after everything that happened. Ava looked down at her score. I have never played for this many people. Ethan smiled. You already played for the one person who needed it most. Ava laughed softly for the first time that evening. Richard noticed the tension slowly leaving her shoulders. Your mother, he asked. Is she here tonight? Ava shook her head. She is working another overnight shift at the hospital. Richard immediately looked toward one of the foundation assistants. Please call Massachusetts General Hospital. Tell Nurse Denise Brooks that transportation is waiting if she wishes to attend the remainder of tonight's program. Ava looked up in surprise. She would never leave her patients unless someone covered for her. The assistant smiled after making a quick call. Her supervisor already approved it. They told her to go. Ava covered her mouth, unable to speak for several seconds. Across the hallway, Eleanor stepped forward. Her voice sounded quieter than anyone had ever heard before. "Miss Brooks," Ava turned politely. "Yes, ma'am?" Eleanor looked directly into her eyes. "I believed I was protecting the reputation of this competition. Instead, I forgot what gives it value in the first place. I am sincerely sorry." Ava studied her for a long moment before answering with complete honesty. "I hope the next girl never has to wonder whether she belongs." Eleanor slowly nodded. "Neither do I." Those words lingered in the hallway as the stage manager returned. "We are ready." Richard extended his hand toward the stage entrance, not as the chairman of the foundation, but simply as someone trying to make a wrong decision right. "Miss Brooks," he said with a gentle smile, "the audience came tonight expecting to discover extraordinary talent. I believe they have been waiting long enough." Ava looked once more at the pages of Second Sunrise, then carefully placed them on top of the piano before lifting them again with renewed confidence. She walked toward the stage beside Ethan and Richard, while behind them the backstage corridor remained perfectly still. The same hallway that had quietly hidden her only minutes earlier was now watching her walk into the light, with every door finally standing open. The master of ceremonies stepped back from the microphone as Ava Brooks walked onto the stage, carrying nothing except the handwritten score that had traveled with her from a small apartment in Dorchester to one of the most respected concert halls in America. For a brief moment, the audience seemed uncertain. Many had already read the printed program and knew her name was not supposed to appear. Quiet whispers drifted across the balconies before fading into complete silence. Ava reached the concert grand piano and gently placed the pages of Second Sunrise on the music stand. She paused, looking out across the sea of unfamiliar faces glowing beneath the warm lights. Then she noticed someone entering through the rear doors. Denise Brooks stood there wearing light blue hospital scrubs beneath a borrowed coat, still carrying the exhaustion of a long nursing shift. One of the ushers quietly guided her toward an empty seat near the front. When Ava saw her mother smile with tears in her eyes, every ounce of fear inside her settled into calm. She lowered herself onto the piano bench and took one slow breath. The first note floated into the hall with extraordinary softness, almost too gentle to notice. Then another followed, and another, until the melody slowly unfolded like sunrise stretching across Boston Harbor after a long winter night. No one reached for a phone. No one whispered anymore. Even the photographers waiting near the stage slowly lowered their cameras as though they understood that this moment deserved to be witnessed before it was recorded. Ethan closed his eyes, smiling exactly as he had inside the hospital chapel months earlier. Denise pressed one hand gently over her heart. Richard Montgomery remained standing at the side of the stage, listening with an expression no board meeting had ever placed on his face. Every measure carried warmth instead of pride, compassion instead of performance. It did not sound like a composition written to impress judges. It sounded like hope becoming music. When the final movement arrived, the melody rose with quiet confidence before settling into the same peaceful ending Ava had finally completed on the morning she left home. Her hands rested on the final chord until its last vibration disappeared into the vast ceiling above. The silence that followed lasted several unforgettable seconds. It was not hesitation. It was reverence. Then one person stood. Richard began applauding with slow, steady hands. Ethan stood beside him. Denise rose next. Within moments, every member of the audience was on their feet. The applause filled the hall with a warmth greater than any orchestra could have produced. Some smiled through tears. Others simply watched the young composer at the piano, understanding that they had witnessed something far more meaningful than a competition. Richard stepped onto the stage after the applause finally softened. He accepted the microphone but looked directly at Ava instead of the audience. "Tonight," he said quietly, "we almost made the mistake of believing that excellence could be measured by background instead of character, by appearances instead of ability. A young composer reminded us that true greatness does not ask where someone comes from. It asks what they bring into the lives of others." He turned toward the audience. "The New England Youth Arts Foundation will immediately revise its selection procedures to ensure every student is judged only by merit. And with the unanimous agreement of the board, the recipient of this year's highest honor is Ava Brooks." The hall erupted once again. Ava accepted the Crystal Award with both hands, then looked toward Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor offered a sincere nod before joining the applause herself. Ava finally stepped to the microphone. She smiled gently but spoke only one sentence. "I hope every child who loves music believes there is still a place waiting for them." She stepped away without another word. As guests slowly left Boston Symphony Hall later that evening, The marble corridors felt different than they had only hours earlier. Volunteers removed banners, musicians packed instruments, and workers dimmed the chandeliers one by one. Richard watched Ava and Denise walk toward the subway station instead of the line of waiting luxury cars. Before they disappeared around the corner, Ethan waved enthusiastically. Ava waved back with the same quiet kindness she had shown in the hospital chapel months before. Richard smiled to himself as the cool Massachusetts night settled over the city. He finally understood something that could never be printed inside a program or engraved onto a trophy. Talent may earn applause, but kindness is what people remember long after the music fades. Above the empty stage, the last work light reflected softly across the polished piano, and in the stillness that remained, it almost felt as though the hall itself had learned to listen.